Good morning. My name is Anthony Davis. The date is April the 8th, 2008. I'm about to publish a paper on a new theory, Twin Vortex Theory, a grand unified theory. As much of the theory is visual in nature, I'm adding a short address in the form of this video recording. This recording, the drawings and clarifications, should all be seen and treated as part of the paper itself and be subject to all the caveats and responsibilities implied therein. The copyright remains vested in me. The obvious question is, why has the unified theory proved to be so elusive? The crucial first step in analyzing a problem is to choose the correct model. Only when the correct model has been identified is it possible to derive equations and numerical values with some degree of confidence. There may be several mathematical techniques which will yield valid equations, but there will only be one definitive model which fits all the observations. When no one could find a model which would unify relativity with quantum theory, physicists decided to rely exclusively on mathematics. The mathematics which they used was incomplete because it assumed particles to be points. Hence, the spin of a particle such as an electron can apparently only be up or down. Once I realized that points are merely locations in space which have no existence in reality, I knew that I held the key. Not only to particle physics, but to phenomena such as the black hole, where matter is supposed to disappear into a singularity. A singularity has zero surface, and an entity with zero surface cannot exist in the real universe. Infinite pressure would be required to crush a particle of matter into nothing. The model which I have described as Twin Vortex Theory satisfies the 6 most important criteria for a unified theory. It is comprehensible. It unifies gravitation and electromagnetism in a single field. It provides a logical theoretical basis for the principles of physics. It details a seamless transition from a null state to the most complex atoms and molecular structures. It appears to conform with all experimental evidence. And finally, it requires the minimum number of dimensions, namely 3. A note of caution. However compelling the model may be, it is only a model. It is not the absolute truth. Merely one self-consistent representation of the truth. A truth which is almost beyond our comprehension. To start with, let's discuss the Bohr model of the atom and the periodic table. As you know, the periodic table lists the elements and arranges them so that atoms with similar properties are organized in columns. The simplest and most abundant element is hydrogen, which comprises a positively charged nucleus and a negatively charged electron. The electrostatic charge on these two particles is equal but opposite, hence they attract each other. But the net charge is -1 plus 1, which is 0. The particles both have mass, so there's also a weak gravitational attraction between them. The Bohr model of the atom, although it has been superseded by current theories, provides a good visual analogy. The electron orbits the central proton because otherwise it would be at rest on the surface of the nucleus. If we think of the nucleus as being the size of an orange, then the electron would be orbiting about 2 miles away. The next largest atom is helium. Now, the accepted view is that the helium nucleus contains 2 protons and 2 neutrons. The 2 protons have a net charge of +2, and the 2 neutrons, which have 0 charge, contribute to the stability and mass of the particle. The difficulty with this model of the helium nucleus is that the protons are both positively charged, which means that they repel each other. The neutrons carry no charge, so they only contribute to the relatively weak gravitational attraction between the 4 nucleons. Physicists decided that there must be a missing strong force which stopped the particles from flying apart. Particle physicists went further and said that these forces were mediated by special particles, which were given the name of gluons because they glued the nucleons together. The protons and the nucleons were arranged on separate shells, which were either part filled, empty, or full. So in the helium nucleus we have one shell which contains 2 neutrons and another shell which contains 2 protons, with the gluons somewhere in the middle holding the 2 shells together. Inevitably, the problem with the particle physicist's view of matter is that the particles are arranged asymmetrically, even though the atomic nucleus is the most symmetrical possible shape, which is of course a sphere. In terms of the Bohr model, a neutron is a hydrogen atom with the electron at rest on the surface. The so-called neutron in the atomic nucleus is actually a proton and a separate electron. The electrons hold the protons together, and no special forces are necessary. Only electromagnetism and gravity are required. If the 4 protons in the helium nucleus are to be arranged as symmetrically as possible, they must be evenly spaced around the sphere, and in geometric terms, they will then be located on the vertices of a tetrahedron. There's then the question of where to place the 2 electrons so that they can be used as the glue holding the protons together. Today we know something which Niels Bohr did not. When atomic nuclei are smashed in a particle accelerator, bits of energy go missing. One of these bits, called the down quark, has a charge of -1/3. So each unit negative charge on the electron is equivalent to 3 down quarks, each with a charge of -1/3. A -2 charge can be shared between 6 quarks, and these fit neatly along the 6 edges of the tetrahedron which defines the helium nucleus. Now we have 4 triangular faces with a proton on each vertex and 3 down quarks midway between the protons. The shell of mixed quarks and protons behaves like the elastic surface of a balloon, which resists the radial force pushing the particles apart. The protons in the atomic nuclei are always evenly spaced on the surface of a sphere, and the electrons are located between the protons. Each shell is filled with a fixed number of particles, and each shell carries a net positive charge, which prevents the larger shells from collapsing. The bigger the nucleus, the more spherical shells it contains. The number of nucleons per shell is determined by the radius of the shell. The location of the particles on the shells can be determined from the geometry of the Platonic solids, which are the tetrahedron, the cube, the octahedron, the icosahedron, and the dodecahedron. And these have 4, 8, 6, 12, and 20 vertices respectively. Now, some shell groups are multiple sets of similar shells, and these are more stable than single shells. Also, a switch to a larger shell is associated with a dip in the mass per nucleon, which is an indication of stability. Now, actually, in my paper, there is a table demonstrating this relationship. The TVT model explains the magic numbers associated with the binding energy of nucleons in terms of their structure. Furthermore, the model identifies the fact that the outer shell of the transuranium elements is shaped like a buckyball, which has 60 vertices and makes this shape relatively stable. There were a few problems with the Bohr model. The first was that it does not give an energy value for the electron when it's in its ground state. The orbiting electron acquires energy in quantum steps and releases it in quantum steps. It is for this reason that every element emits radiation of a characteristic frequency. The Bohr model did not give a value for the lowest frequency associated with an atom. The model ran out of orbits and the electron crashed onto the nucleus. Furthermore, quantum theory tells us that the location of the electron is indeterminate. It exists in a cloud of probability and not at a specific location. That is why the physicists sat down and wrote complicated wave equations, because these equations treated matter as a probability wave and gave a value for the energy of the ground state. The wave-particle duality of particles, which sometimes behave like a particle and sometimes like a wave, was accepted as an experimental fact with no theoretical justification. It is possible to retain the Bohr model in a slightly modified form. The orbiting electron constitutes an electrical current, which has an associated magnetic field. The electron interacts solely through this electromagnetic field. So an orbiting electron is a circling ring of electromagnetic energy. The actual location of the electron particle within the ring is of no significance until the ring is broken, and then the electron shoots off into space. The ground state can also be visualized. The electron is larger than the proton, so the electron shell can actually surround the proton and not orbit at all. And that is, of course, the most stable arrangement. Although the electron carries a negative charge on its outer surface, the positively charged inner surface is repelled by the positively charged nucleus, and stability is maintained. Now, you might be thinking, so you have three particles in your model: the proton, the electron, and the quark. In fact, there is only one fundamental particle in the theory, and that is the photon. The photon is itself electromagnetic energy, and it takes the form of a torus. The torus spins in a circle about an axis, and the surface of the torus also spins. The circular spin is the electrical field, and the surface spin is the magnetic field. The structure is similar to a smoke ring, a vortex which will persist forever if it exists in a frictionless and homogeneous ideal fluid. The net electrical charge of the photon is zero because the electrical circuit is closed. The gravitational field is also zero because that is only associated with an open electrostatic field. The net magnetic field is almost zero because the opposite sides of the torus rotate in opposite directions. The spinning electromagnetic field pulls a photon through empty space at the speed of light. When a photon ring interacts with an electron ring, and that is orbiting a nucleus, the two fields merge. The electron ring absorbs a quantum of energy by jumping into a higher orbit. Photons can be grouped together to form charged particles of matter by arranging them symmetrically on the surface of a sphere. The sign of the electrical charge is determined by the direction of spin of the photon, clockwise or anti-clockwise. Once again, 4 spins is the minimum number which can be placed symmetrically on the surface of a sphere. If the spin is negative, the particle is a dung quark with a charge of -1/3, and if it is positive, it is an anti-dung quark. Hence, the charge associated with each spin is 1/12, and an electron contains 12 negative spins. Each spinning photon generates a funnel vortice, which sucks energy from empty space into the particle. The principle is similar to that of the Dyson vacuum cleaner, which generates suction by creating a spinning vortex of air. The spin of the vortex is electromagnetic energy, and the inflow is gravity. Gravity and electromagnetism are therefore inextricably linked. One does not exist without the other. The vortices which extend out into space from the surface of the particle all spin in the same direction, either clockwise or anti-clockwise. 2 vortices which are spinning in the same direction will attempt to move together, as the energy of the combined system is minimized when they are coincident. Now, this movement is usually interpreted as an indication of an attractive force. Vortices which are spinning in opposite directions will repel each other. The forces will be greater when the 2 vortices are coaxial, and will be smaller when the vortex axes are aligned in parallel. In the case of a pair of tornadoes, two vortices will eventually merge to form a larger tornado. The situation is different at the subatomic level. The vortices can only merge up to the point near the vortex origin where the fluid has transformed into the solid ring of the photon. The surface of the particle behaves like an elastic medium, which is in tension, but the two vortices do not merge because each photon behaves like a solid particle. This is the theoretical basis for the Pauli exclusion principle. In terms of electromagnetic theory, the attraction between two similar vortices placed side by side is described as magnetic attraction. The force experienced when the two similar funnel vortices are aligned coaxially is said to be due to an electrostatic field. Surfaces of the same electrical polarity, that is, with the same spin, will repel each other. And the converse is true when the particles are of different polarity. Electrical theory states that a rotating magnetic field is associated with an electric current. The free electrons in the conductor drift very slowly from the negative terminal to the positive terminal under the influence of the electromagnetic field, but that can move at the speed of light. The electromagnetic field is well defined, but the position of individual electrons within the field is indeterminate. In the twin vortex theory, the electrons are orbiting the atomic nuclei above axes which are parallel to the axis of the electrostatic field. Each orbiting electron generates a spinning torus in which the electrical field spins on a plane and the magnetic field spins around the axis of the electrical field. The magnetic field surrounding the conductor is therefore simply the sum of all the individual electron fields viewed edgeways. When an electrical conductor is wound into a coil, the magnetic field again rotates about an axis which is perpendicular to the direction of current flow. Conversely, an electric current is generated when a conducting loop is rotated in a linear magnetic field. And also, electromagnetic waves, such as radio waves, are vortices. The electrons in a bar magnet are spinning diagonally within the conductor lattice. So all the experimental evidence suggests that an electromagnetic field is associated with spin. So not only is there just one fundamental particle, the photon, that photon may be considered to be the only detectable structure within a large vortex. The vortex itself is generated by movement in 3 dimensions. So all that we have at a fundamental level is the energy of motion. That energy emerged from null space. All that is required to construct a universe is movement in 3 dimensions and the properties of symmetry. So far I have explained the structure of the photon and the quarks. But what about the proton? The proton is an assembly of quarks. There are 4 positive quarks located on the vertices of a tetrahedron and 1 negative quark placed centrally. When the proton is smashed, the positive anti-down quarks combine in pairs to form up quarks, which have 6 spins and a charge of +2/3 each. The stability of the proton relies on the fact that the electrostatic repulsion operates in a completely different manner from electrostatic attraction. When a positively charged particle attracts a negatively charged particle, the spin screws out of one surface and into the other. When two particles with the same spin repel, the vortices have to bend until they become perpendicular to a line joining the two particles. The energy stored in the bent field lines is greater than that stored in the straight field lines. The spin energy of the photon is electromagnetic energy. Mass equates to the potential energy required to lift the photon from the center of the nucleus to its equilibrium position on a shell. And for this reason, the potential energy of a particle is called binding energy. The field properties of empty space are the sum of all the individual particle fields, and it is these which determine the mass and the electromagnetic characteristics of an object. The physical properties of an object exist in the space outside the object. So, in answer to the question, there is only one fundamental particle, the photon. All other particles are assemblies of photons. Furthermore, the electromagnetic field within the photon is in the densest possible state. Any input of energy changes the radius of the torus, and it becomes a larger particle, such as an electron. The larger particle contains more energy, but that energy is spread over a larger area because the size of the hole in the torus has increased. An interesting query is, how does the photon become trapped on the surface of a larger particle? This is where we move on to the experimental observations of high-energy physics. If two photons with sufficient energy are forced to collide, an electron-anti-electron pair is produced. At higher energy level, the photons are transformed into a proton-antiproton pair. At even higher energy levels, the heavier atomic nuclei are produced. The energy contained in a photon is determined by its frequency, as the velocity of the photon is fixed. There is no magic about the production of particles with mass from zero-mass photons. Some of the kinetic energy of the photon is transformed into the binding energy of mass. The spinning torus of the photon is broken because it is no longer traveling at the speed of light. The spins become organized on the surface of a sphere because this is the lowest energy configuration for that particular amount of energy. Is this of any relevance to the Big Bang theory of creation? It is, but the Big Bang theory is overly complex. Prior to the instant of creation, the energy levels of the universe must have been zero. In the TVT model, a null state is assumed to be unstable because energy levels must be exactly zero throughout such a system for stability to be maintained. Now, zero does not occur anywhere in the universe except as the sum of two quantities which are of opposite sign. If random energy fluctuations in null space are permitted, zero will cease to exist and particles will appear out of nowhere. Two photons traveling in opposite directions comprise a photon-antiphoton pair. The net energy of a photon-antiphoton pair is zero if they are rotating on a common plane. However, once the delicate balance has been disturbed, a photon pair can appear, created from nothing. Photon-antiphoton pairs of particles can pop into existence anywhere in space, particularly in regions where the net energy field approaches zero. The creation of the first photon-antiphoton pair in the null universe would have set off a chain reaction, because the surrounding null space would have been destabilized by the initial disturbance. The chain reaction would have been comparable to the flash vaporization of a superheated liquid, and this phenomenon has sometimes been described as a white hole. A superheated liquid achieves a temperature in excess of its normal boiling point. The liquid does not boil because it is so homogeneous that there is no seed to initiate bubble formation. When a superheated liquid is suddenly disturbed, that disturbance propagates through the fluid at a speed which is in excess of the velocity of the individual particles. The transformation from fluid to vapor is explosive and instantaneous. The vapor molecules do not originate from a single point, the disturbance does. The distance we can see into the universe is a function of the time which has elapsed since the formation of the initial white hole. Other universes could exist beyond that time horizon. There is no reason for our universe to be unique, because a white hole can form anywhere in null space. The theory indicates that every galaxy is a mini-universe, and that our universe is the sum of all the many universes which have been engulfed since the creation of our galaxy. This interpretation is supported by the suggestion that at the center of every galaxy there is a residual black hole, a feature created by the implosion which accompanied the formation of the initial white hole. Physicists have noted that the physical characteristics of the universe are finely balanced, and that galaxies are distributed uniformly throughout space. The theory indicates that new galaxies must be born in the gaps between established galaxies when the intergalactic spacing reaches some critical value. That is, when the background field in the interstices has effectively fallen to zero. Hence, the density of the universe remains constant, and the galaxies do not lose contact with their neighbors, even though the universe as a whole is expanding. And almost finally, what about dark matter? The effect of entanglement is not limited to photons. Any objects rotating in a fixed relationship can become entangled. The effect can be seen in large spiral galaxies, where the outer arms appear to rotate more quickly than anticipated. The outermost stars are affected only by stars rotating closer in, and the outer groups of stars tend towards solid body rotation, because the energy stored in the system is least when these objects are close together. The orbital velocity of such a system of entangled stars is determined by the center of mass of the star groups, which orbit closer in than the individual peripheral stars. The effect is compounded by the fact that the gravitational field at the center of a spiral galaxy ceases to be spherical. The field lines which emerge radially from the center of the galaxy are distorted by the combined mass of the stars, which are arranged in disk formation. The field lines become bent until they're almost parallel to the plane of the spiral galaxy, before curving back perpendicular to the surfaces of the outermost stars. The curvature of the field from a radial direction increases the gravitational attraction on the outermost stars. The phenomenon is not caused by undetectable dark matter. Until now, I have made no mention of Einstein's theory of relativity. Is this also subject to review in the light of twin vortex theory? Einstein's theory of relativity is an interesting example of how the mathematics can complicate the reality. Time virtually stands still for an isolated particle or atomic nucleus. The vortices which define an isolated mass would appear static to an observer, except for the periodic ejection of a photon. The vortices deform asymmetrically, and movement is initiated when particles interact with each other. The passage of time is inferred when objects move in an energy gradient. Time is defined by motion. The decreasing radius of the field vortices in the vicinity of matter can be described in terms of a physical compression of space. Einstein dubbed the effect gravitation to distinguish the effect from gravity and its historical association with a force acting at a distance. Gravitation defines the mass of a particle. Clock speed is affected by a radial gravitational field because objects are compressed in a high gravity field. A clock at sea level will therefore appear to run faster than a clock at higher altitude, although this effect can only be determined by extremely accurate measurement of time. There's a further complication associated with the passage of time, which was also identified by Einstein. The rate at which time passes is influenced by the velocity and acceleration of the very clock which is used to measure the passage of time. Einstein derived the equations for relativistic effects and explained the results by claiming that time is the fourth dimension. Although this definition does satisfy the equations, such a concept is confusing. Moreover, the equations give the misleading impression that velocity stretches an object in the direction of motion, because implicit in the equations is an assumption that dimensions are not scaled perpendicular to the direction of motion. Now, if a moving object changes shape, it must stretch radially in all directions, because asymmetric distortion can only occur when an object is accelerated linearly. Such dimensional scaling has the opposite effect to the radial compression caused by gravitation. The equations of relativity can be explained without reference to a fourth dimension if objects expand when they are in motion. The concept that an object is scaled up when it acquires energy is familiar. When a solid material is heated, the spacing between individual atoms increases and the material expands. Dimensions measured with a heated scale would appear shorter than those measured with the scale when it is cold. An observer traveling at relativistic speed is larger than the same observer when static. The moving observer sees the external world as scaled down because his device for measuring scale is longer than that of the static observer. The moving observer sees external events as being speeded up because all velocities remain constant, but distances have been scaled down. Clock which is in motion appears to run more slowly than the same clock when it is static, because the static observer sees the light travelling a greater distance in the larger moving clock. The moving observer sees the light travelling a shorter distance in the smaller static clock. The velocity of an object is not relative to an arbitrary frame of reference, because every object in the universe follows a curved path. The instantaneous absolute velocity of an object can always be determined from the radius of curvature, which defines a specific origin. The static clock speed of any object may therefore be calculated from its instantaneous angular velocity. The larger the radius of the orbit, the slower the clock runs. The clock never runs backwards, so it is impossible to travel into the past. It is only possible for an astronaut to travel into the future because all physical processes on his spacecraft run slow. The reason for the probabilistic nature of matter is now apparent. A particle travelling at close to the speed of light is much larger than the same particle at rest. It can interact with matter at any point on its surface. Photons which travel at the speed of light are infinite in extent and can therefore interact over vast distances. When two photons are orbiting synchronously, they are said to be entangled. If one is flipped, the other also flips. The two fields are virtually one. Can this scaling effect explain the classic interference pattern which demonstrates the wavelike properties of the photon? A photographic plate placed behind a pinhole through which a photon has passed will record a hit at some point on the photon ring where it interacts with an electron ring on the photographic plate. The interference pattern in the energy fields is present even before the photon arrives, but the peaks and troughs are not visible until photon interaction occurs. When the photon passes through the pinhole aperture, the particle is slowed and decreases in diameter as relativistic scaling takes effect. When a photon is slowed down, its collapse is almost instantaneous. On emerging from the pinhole, the photon ring accelerates and increases in diameter. The photon ring follows one of the paths of least resistance, where the standing wave peaks and troughs have cancelled each other. The interference ring diameter is a function of the velocity of the photon at the point of impact. The photon ring interacts with the circular electromagnetic field associated with just one electron, which is orbiting near the surface of the photographic plate. The probabilistic location of the hit is determined by the instantaneous position of the electron within its circular electromagnetic field at the moment of impact when the two fields merge. A photon which passes through a narrow slit is forced to turn edge on to the direction of travel, and it becomes polarized. If the two narrow slits are arranged in parallel, the standing wave fields are distorted to form linear interference patterns. Once again, the photon follows one of the paths of least resistance where the sum of wave energies is zero. The location of the hit is determined by the position of a single electron when it was ejected from its electron ring. All such interactions can be modelled by the mathematics of probability theory. Thank you for your patience during this discourse. Some of the ideas arising from twin vortex theory challenge long-established theories and suppositions. I have merely assembled the pieces of the jigsaw. Our understanding of the universe will always be a work in progress. That is what makes science so interesting. Thank you.